and go to the PowerPoint. Our lovely frogs are back again. And I like frogs. I don't necessarily like it when they pee on your hand, but I like frogs. They're funny little guys. And because we've got ponds in the front and back of our house, we get the benefit of the song. They sing at night. And so we get from down there, and then we get from over there. And that's how we know spring is here. When we hear that first little frog singing, it's like, okay, the frogs can always tell. They're rarely wrong. And if the frog is singing, then we know spring is right around the corner. Okay, so let's see. The Frog in the Oven. Here's the lyrics to Were You There? And apparently this is one of the oldest versions. There's different versions of it. But the stanza that's in there is, were you there when the sun refused to shine? That's kind of a turnabout, because when we're talking about the Passover, yes, the sun refused to shine when Yeshua was crucified, but if we take it all the way back to Egypt, then we realize if we were there when the sun refused to shine, it was only refusing to shine for the Egyptians. And that's when we see that, yes, the Hebrews had light in all their dwellings. And that must have been a wondrous realization for Israel. Okay, let's go through here. Remember last night, the point was, why did they have to go through all these plagues and so forth? Why couldn't he just take them out of Egypt? It tells us why. It's to establish the truth of Adonai's existence, because right off the bat, Pharaoh claimed not to know who he was. And so by carrying him through these 10 plagues and the sub-plagues, last night I made the point that possibly there was a lot of headaches in Egypt from Pharaoh's dumb decisions. And so head smacking might have been an extra plague. But it was going to establish, if any Israelites were doubtful that they had a God, and he was one God, they were going to know him. And it was through this pressure that they had been experiencing that they were holding on to that hope. If Pharaoh didn't know him through this tribulation, he would. If the Egyptians and the mixed multitude didn't know him through the tribulation, they would. That was the point. And that's what Moses says, that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. So basically we had the two types of frogs that were used so that everyone, the whole world, would know that there is no one like the Lord our God. There's going to be dead frogs and the frogs in the Nile. And so Moses offers, I can take away the frogs out of your houses, out of your ovens, out of your kneading bowls. I can make them stay in the Nile. And nevertheless, there were just heaps and heaps and heaps of dead frogs. So we had dead frogs and living frogs. And this is the contrast that we're getting in the Torah portion, because when we're dealing with Egypt, we're dealing with death. Remember, it was last year, year before last, we did the lesson called, Don't You Know That Egypt is Abaddon? It's the abyss. It represents death. It represents hell. And so that's why Pharaoh is making such dumb decisions. Instead of, when he gets into what he thinks is a magician's competition, instead of doing the life-giving thing, like having his serpent eat up a serpent, which represents sin and death, he just makes more serpents. He just makes more death. He makes more sin. He makes more deception. Instead of cleaning up the bloody water and restoring it to life, he makes more blood. Instead of commanding the frogs to go back into the Nile, his magicians make more frogs. As if they didn't already have a frog infestation, they decide, well, the solution to this is just make more frogs. And I don't know. It sounds like politicians to me. Every time they try to help something, they make it worse. So we've got dead frogs and we've got living frogs. So last night we went through that, pointing out how these were just dumb choices when it comes to the miracles or so forth. And then I wanted you to understand the river frogs, they would have had more of a song than, say, a bullfrog. A bullfrog is like, bah, bah. It's just not that attractive. But in terms of the frogs of the river, they would have been these singing frogs, these frogs of knowledge. All right, and so we say, why knowledge? Well, in order to understand the conflict here, we go back again to the garden, where it says, you know, they realized they were ashamed because they were naked. They had to have garments of skin, and the problem was they had become, they had had a transition, and now they knew yada, which is the same root as dea, both good and evil. In other words, they had experienced both good and evil. And so they were kicked out of the garden to prevent them from remaining in that intimacy of mixing good and evil. And the problem was they did not keep their garments. Remember, part of your garments, you have a garment of salvation, but then you also have a robe of righteousness. And if you don't protect those garments, you can definitely lose that robe of righteousness. And when they mixed the dea of good and evil, then they were unprepared. But until that time, their souls could actually, remember the idea of the garden, the third heaven being no higher than the height a dove can fly. And so our frog here is reminding us of a couple of things. We fell out of the garden because of the knowledge that we acquired, the intimacy that we acquired with with evil. But when we are restored at the resurrection, when we go from death to life, that's when our soul will be able to fly like a bird back into the garden, back to the bird's nest, which is the palace of Messiah mystically. And so it reminds us, don't believe lies. And this is why the frog is going to be associated with lies in the book of Revelation. It's going to be these demonic entities. It says they're going to look like frogs. It's not going to say they are frogs. It's going to say they have a similar appearance as a frog. So it's another contronym. When we look at the frog, there's going to be a good side to a frog. It's a bird of knowledge that reminds us of the restoration to the garden. But on the other hand, that frog can also remind us what happens when we believe a lie and act upon a lie. Because then you fall, you descend to the earth. You can no longer make that transition into the spiritual realm because you don't have the proper clothes. Okay, so there's a secret about the garden that the frog knows, and that's what we want to get to today. Right now, that frog reminds us we can't fly yet, but we will. Someday we will. When the trumpet blows at Yom Teruah, what does the psalmist say? My soul escaped like a bird out of the snare of the fowler. That snare is death. And this Torah portion is showing us how the Spirit is going to be able to save us from death so that our soul can fly like a bird back into the garden with Yeshua. And then we pointed out the anomaly in the text, that one verse will say it's many frogs, and then another verse will say it's a single frog. And of course, we have to look at that. One example, well, how can it be one thing and many things? Well, the Jewish tradition is that the plague of boils was believed to have started with one boil, and then it multiplied into many. And then in Revelation 16, 1-7, we have a passage there describing the same plagues. And it talks about how the angel went out and poured out his bowl on the earth, and it became a loathsome and malignant sore. on the people who had the mark of the beast and who worshiped his image. And Shunda pointed out last night that malignant means something that spreads. So it could be that we did start with one frog and he spread. He somehow multiplied. And these were all the different ideas that some of the sages came up with. One enormous frog that covered all of Egypt. They hit the frog trying to kill it, but then it started spawning, streaming forth swarms and swarms of frogs, apparently like a piñata. And that's also something fun you can do at Pesach. Get a frog piñata, fill it full of stink bait, and then seal it up in a plastic garbage can for about a month before Passover and put it out in a garage or somewhere. And when you take that plastic garbage bag off the piñata, you will have a stinking frog for the kids, if you like that sort of thing. Rashi also says, well, he's just like sheep. He's referring to this swarm of frogs as one thing. One sheep, many sheep, still sheep. But then he says, oh, that doesn't make sense because he's not consistent in the text. Rabbi Akiva says, one frog bred so rapidly that it filled Egypt. But then he was basically reprimanded by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. And he basically told Rabbi Akiva he had no business commenting on this. And this is strange. We want to unpack this because it explains something that is in your Passover haggadah that maybe you read over and you thought, well, why is that in there? There's a context for it that's kind of a hidden message for the people who know the context of the conversation that's going to be related to these frogs. Because remember, they stayed up all night studying, talking about, discussing the Passover, because remember, the commandment is you have to ask yourself, how am I going to tell my children that we were there when I came out of Egypt, when I personally came out? So I have to convey to my child through teaching all the fear, all the anxiety, all the triumph, all the whole gamut of emotions that experiences might have offered to help place those children there. And that's why something fun like a frog piñata with stink bait really helps them to smell what dead frogs would have smelled like. Just don't bring it in your house. I'm warning you. It's not a good thing. So here's what it says. It happened that Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Joshua, Rabbi, hang on, can't read it. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Tarfon were gathered. Why did that do that? I hope y'all can still see that. I did something weird. They were gathered at a seder, and they discussed the exodus from Egypt all that night until their students came in and said, our teachers, time has come for the reading of the morning Shema. And this is the setting in which Rabbi Azariah rebuked Rabbi Akiva for trying to understand the frogs. And so he offers his own explanation, and we read his explanation, and it doesn't sound much better. So what was the point of the correction? Because his idea was, well, there was just one frog, but it croaked. It whistled to all the others, and they came. That doesn't sound, any more logical than one frog bred so rapidly that it filled Egypt, which was Rabbi Akiva's idea. But there's more going on in the text, and I think this is why they included it. It was a prophetic dialogue. Remember, Rabbi Akiva misidentified the Messiah. He thought it was Bar Kokhba. And so that led to a Jewish rebellion, which in turn led to a great slaughter of the Jewish people. But it was not before they suffered greatly under the Romans. And it got to a point, just like with the Greeks, where they couldn't teach Torah or learn Torah publicly. There were just things that, would bring on the death penalty, whipping, they had all sorts of horrible ways to torture you and make you die. But Rabbi Akiva got caught teaching Torah publicly, and so they combed his skin off of him while he was still alive with iron combs. But he died while he was reciting the Shema. So this frog analogy, this thing that's recorded, it's kind of a hidden message to us that if you keep this commandment that you are keeping right now as you do a Passover Seder, because you're reading it as you're reading the Haggadah, you're reading this story. And if you know the story, you realize what the Haggadah is telling you. Just sitting here, obeying the commandment to remember the Passover and observe the Passover might cost you your life. Because that's what it cost Rabbi Akiva to keep the commandments. That's what it cost many Jews to keep the commandments openly, to study the Torah openly. But even though we're talking about dead frogs, and we know that it cost Rabbi Akiva his life, in his death, what it actually did is it spawned many more students of the Torah. Yes, he got a lot of people killed with the false Messiah thing, but his dying words, he recited the Shema. And so lots of students began to study the Torah. And so in that way, he kind of whistled for more frogs to come, even though he was going to die. And it was Rabbi Akiva who said, what's greater, studying Torah or doing Torah? And they concluded, well, it's better to study first, so that when you do, it's going to lead you to action if you will study, and then you will do the correct action. You won't pretty much just go off half-cocked and invent your own interpretations, because Scripture tells us that there's no prophecy that's open to private interpretation, and the Torah is the prophecy, by the way. So he represents to us, when we're going through the Haggadah, the potential of the frog. He can be a false prophet, because remember, he said Bar Kokhba is the Messiah, and he wasn't, and he got people killed. But on the other hand, he can sing the Shema, which can become a song of martyrdom for the unity, the oneness of the name, the greatest commandment, the commandment to love. And then we get more information. We have the setting of this discussion of Torah study, and it's taking place in someone's attic. And again, that's a historical detail. It tells you that as they're discussing these fine points of the Torah and the Exodus, they're in hiding. But there came a point, see, they're sitting around debating the details. It's a place hidden from public view, because to discuss it openly would be to invite martyrdom and death. Eventually, that's what Rabbi Akiva did. He came out in the open, and it cost him his life. But it was in that same attic that the Torah teachers were sitting around discussing under what conditions is martyrdom for the Torah required. Because the idea is you shall live in them, not die in them, right? So they decided on three things: idolatry, sexual licentiousness, and murder. You should never commit those sins just to save your own skin, to save your own life. So when you're reading this boring passage, if you don't know the context, understand it could be actually a message from context. It may not make sense the first 20 times you read it, but then there will come a time where you will understand the context. And what it is, it's a message of martyrdom. If you're an Israelite observing a seder, it's telling you, because see, in our day and time, most people who observe a seder, they can do it comfortably in their homes. They might rent a public hall and do it as a group. Or there might be some places that say you were trying to do it in China, you would have to do it in secret. You would have to do it in an attic or a hidden place, because it could cost you your life or torture. So whoever you are, whether you have the most comfortable and ideal of conditions for your seder, or whether you also are in hiding as you do the seder, as you tell the story of the Exodus, you see the difference between the two kinds of people. One kind of people is going to have to work really hard to sing "Were You There?" because they're not really experiencing the fear and the affliction and the torture that you're supposed to feel as you go through the Seder. Those who are hiding in attics and hidden places, afraid to come out in the open, they get it. They understand that keeping a commandment openly or talking about Torah openly or being caught with a copy of the Torah, it could cost them their lives. Nevertheless, whether you've got the best or the worst of conditions, we all have the same commandment. We all have to say, when I came out of Egypt. We all have to tremble at the price we might pay for observing this Seder, the price we might pay for studying the Torah, the price we might pay for putting those commandments that we're studying into action in a public place. And so when you read through that in the Seder next year, then just remember what it's there for, to remind you that at some time and at some place, you may have to sacrifice greatly in order to keep that commandment. Now, Amazing Grace, which I played a Native American version of it. I don't know if you know the history of the Trail of Tears. When Native Americans had their lands taken from them, every treaty was broken, and eventually they were moved to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, and a huge number of them got sick and died along the way. The amazing thing about the Trail of Tears is that these Native Americans sang Amazing Grace along the trail. They're a broken people. They're a dying people. They've lost everything that was theirs. But nevertheless, they're saying the same thing as, were you there? They're identifying with their situation, saying, yes, I am there. I am here in danger. I am here in labor. I am here in a snare of the enemy. I am here. I can identify with Yeshua and the fellowship of his suffering. But they're still singing Amazing Grace. They still have a hope that Yeshua is going to be that light that will eventually separate from the darkness, make a distinction, stop the suffering. And so with these songs, we hear of people trying to keep their garments ready for a journey home because they've lost theirs. And so this Passover Seder, it's something you can do even when you're not in the land. You can't offer the Passover sacrifice, no. Plus, Yeshua is our sacrifice. But as you go through this Seder, it's absolutely fitting to do this no matter where you are in the world. Because no matter where you are in the world, there is suffering for the sake of the testimony of Yeshua and the commandments of God. It's always been since we fell out of the garden, and it will be until Yeshua returns and gracefully helps us to cross over that river. So remember, we're debating here frogs. And one thing we know about frogs is when the night sets in, that's when they start singing together. It might start with one, and it doesn't take long. You got a whole chorus of them. And so when we read this strange passage about the rabbis debating about the Exodus so long that it was time for the morning Shema, then we have a little bit more information. And just remember, you would say the Shema at the evening and in the morning, the time when the frogs start singing and the time when they would stop. typically. So as you continue through the seder, in that section, it says, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and pay special attention to his last name, I guess you would call it, ben Azariah, son of Azariah, which is going to connect you with him, with a specific person, said, I am like a 70-year-old man, but I could not succeed in having the exodus from Egypt mentioned every night until Ben Zoma explained it. In order that you may remember the day you left Egypt, all the days of your life. The phrase days of your life would have indicated only the days. The addition of the word all includes the nights as well. But the sages declare that the days of your life mean only the present world. The addition of all includes the era of Messiah. So this Passover experience, this coming through tribulation, it doesn't just apply to the days of this life. There are elements of the Passover and the Exodus that are also going to apply to the era of Messiah. And so you see what Ben Azariah is doing. He's shifting the importance of night as that hidden part of the day referred to as all. And now he says both day and night become a new day. And that new day is the era of Messiah's kingdom. So when a frog sings, it sings at night. But it's singing of a forever kingdom where there's not going to be any more night. There's only going to be day. So the frog song is an encouragement in darkness. Remember in Were You There? That final stanza was, were you there when the sun refused to shine? And so in that darkness, in that time of trembling, in that time of death, in that time of being a slave in Egypt, in that time maybe of being martyred for the Torah, you can hear the frog song. You can remember the frog because every year you name the plagues. And one of them is Tzefardea. And we don't say plural either. When we do the plagues at the seder, we say Tzefardea. We say singular. It's one frog, even though it's many frogs. But you know this song that the frog is singing. You know exactly what those frogs are singing. Exodus 8, verse 1 says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Go to Pharaoh and say to him, Thus says the Lord, let my people go, that they may serve me. But if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite your whole territory with frogs. The Nile will swarm with frogs, which will come up and go into your house and into your bedroom and on your bed and into the houses of your servants and on your people and into your ovens and into your kneading bowls. So the frogs will come up on you and your people and all your servants. So none of these other places are strange if there's a frog invasion, except the oven. The oven is a strange choice. And basically, what do you get? Martyrdom. A frog that's going to jump into an oven is going to die now. A frog that jumps into your bed, maybe later. But the frog that jumps in the oven just voluntarily jumps to his death on the commandment. And that's the strange thing here. The frogs came out of the Nile and obeyed a divine commandment to commit suicide. And we're not advocating that here. All right, let me make that disclaimer. Please don't go out and say, I said to make yourself a martyr for the kingdom. You really do need to study like the rabbis did before you make up your mind to go out and do that. But no, we are not advocating suicide, but that's exactly what the frogs did. And so just like having this embedded in the Haggadah, it's telling you this is a time of year to contemplate the cost of serving and worshiping the Holy One. Because the frogs leapt into hot ovens. They serve their Creator with their body and their soul, even their animal soul. And the text is hinting at that bird-like quality of a frog. Remember, they would have been created on the fifth day like the birds because they were swarms. And I'm not sure if they counted as the swarming things of the water or not, but they're definitely water creatures, but they can live on land for a limited time. But it says the frogs Allah, they went up. And that's mimicking the idea of a soul that's ready to ascend, like the Olah offering, the whole burnt offering, if you want to call it that. That's kind of what these frogs did. They went up and they offered themselves as an offering. And then, of course, the context is if someone ever tries to force you to commit idolatry, sexual immorality, or murder, then, it may be better to just say, well, do what you think you got to do, but I'm not doing that. So according to one rabbi, it's these frogs who jumped into the ovens that inspired 3 other men facing the oven. And that's why I wanted you to pay attention to the name. In Daniel 1:6, it says, now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so I asked for a volunteer who might have a Bible handy, who would read that passage. Do I have a volunteer in Daniel? It would be 3:8-30.
Alyssa, I'll read it. It is 1:3 through
Daniel 3:8-30.
8 through 30. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the tigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the tigron, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. And Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed these men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the king's counselor gathered together and saw that the fire had not any power over the bodies of these men. The hair of their heads was not singed, and the cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid to ruin. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon.
Now that's how you cross the river. You need that 4th one who has the appearance of the Son of God. That's what happens when you jump in the furnace. And remember, there were 3 things they discussed. They said it's better to be a martyr than to commit murder, sexual immorality, and idolatry. And so not only did they have the idolatry question, they were supposed to commit this sin with all the best music of Babylon. And so we've got our singing frogs who are going to jump into the oven. Of course, the frogs are going to die. They're not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But you see the parallel there. The miracle, again, yes, they weren't burned up. They didn't even have the smell of smoke. But even their garments didn't have the smell of smoke. You see it. Why keeping your garments is part of living in the garden. Because if you will keep your garments until Yeshua comes, which we are commanded repeatedly to do in the Brit Hadashah, if you will keep your garments, then they won't even smell like smoke once you cross the river. Whether you're a martyr or not. We can always pray that we don't have to be martyred in such a fashion. Fire hurts, but we got a great object lesson from the frogs, and how the rabbis say that's what encouraged Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego at this point. They say if even a frog would obey a command to jump in the oven, how can we do less? And that's why he said, we don't even have to answer yet. We already know what we're going to do. We would rather be martyrs for the kingdom than to bow down and worship this idol. So that's pretty encouraging. Okay, we'll get back here. And their Hebrew names tell us a lot because Hananiah, Yah favored, makes you think of the Amazing Grace song. Then you've got Mishael, who is what El is. In other words, there's no one beside him, which is the whole message that Pharaoh needs to understand and the one that Nebuchadnezzar needed to understand. There is no other God. And then Azariah is Yah helped. He's going to help us. He's going to give us that grace. In spite of our trembling in a situation, We can be like these Jewish wise men who keep their garments even in the midst of the fire, even in the oven, because garments of obedience will not burn in heavenly rivers. It's because of Yah's favor. It's because of who he is. It's because he's able to help us to cross those burning rivers of Eden. And we just have to realize one day it's going to be the wicked who burn up, and their clothes will go too. Their wicked deeds, they will not pass. Which sounds very Monty Python. Okay, so we have another incident here that suggests who that fourth person was. It's in Exodus 3:2. It says, the angel of the Lord appeared to Moshe in a blazing fire from the midst of the bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. And Yeshua tells us in Matthew 10:28, don't fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul. Rather, fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. And so basically, Yeshua is saying, tremble. Because you were there, you were here. Because you identify with these martyrs for the kingdom. Because you identify as an Israelite. You have the ability to tremble at the fear of Adonai. You know there is none other than El. And because you were there, you are here. And because you were here with him, you were there. One of the discussions, if you don't understand Midrash, and even some of the rabbinic commentary, there's a link here on the screen. If you've not listened to Aleph Beta before, you get a certain amount you can listen to free each month. But this one is a Midrash on Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses. It explains how the Midrash operates, how it's not the Torah itself, but how it enhances understanding the Torah portion, because we're talking a lot about Rashi and Rabbi Akiva and so forth, and their investment in this seder. But they will draw these connections sometimes. If we don't know the context, sometimes it doesn't make sense. But there's just a little short video there that'll help you understand kind of how the Midrash works. But there's the parallel there between the frog and the Israelites. The more the Israelites were afflicted, the more they reproduced and spread out. And this is what Rashi's saying. The more they beat the frog, the more frogs it made. Just like Rabbi Akiva produced more Torah frogs. Even in his martyrdom, and in spite of having misidentified the Messiah, it still served a purpose because it spawned the passion for Torah study. And for us, we know who Messiah is. We have not had false Messiah problems. We know that Yeshua is a Messiah. So if his students could, be spawned out of Rabbi Akiva's martyrdom, how much more should Yeshua's beating, Yeshua's death and resurrection produce us, multiplied, should produce, these singing frogs who were willing to, figuratively, jump into ovens of persecution for the study of the Torah. And Yeshua was the one who kept talking about disciples, 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 disciples. A disciple is somebody who learns. And why do we learn? Because it leads to action. It leads to these big decisions. And I know this is stupid. There's a place near here called Frog Level. So if you would like to buy a house at Frog Level, there's the real estate you can contact. It's near Goose Creek. But at the end, they gathered up the dead frogs because remember, dead things defile, and Egypt is this picture of death. And these frogs, once they came out of the water, they were unable to sustain life. And so they were gathered up from being scattered. Remember, gathering and scattering is like the big theme of Workbook 1. But in the end, they really were just one pile of dead frog. Frogs are amphibians. They belong in the rivers, the streams, the lakes, the ponds. That's where they sing their song. That's where they live. And we're the same way. We need to return, like the frog, to the rivers of Eden, because that's where we're alive. And that's where life can be sustained in us. That's our home. So when we hear the frog song, it does remind us of martyrdom. What would we endure to obey a commandment? What would we endure to gather and study Torah? And I think we are a people who have heard a whistle, calling them to the Torah, calling us to the study of the Torah. But there's a danger in that. Lots of people have heard the whistle. But if they don't understand the frog, that yes, it is a knowledgeable bird and it does give us hope of resurrection. But the frog was a martyr too. The frog jumped into the oven because he obeyed a commandment. And so if it's a bird of knowledge of the word, the more intimate you are with the word, the more you will suffer for the sake of that word. And if you don't get that, you're in danger. Somebody needs to tell you. And if you know people who are studying Torah and think that there is no cost associated with it, help them understand they have to count the cost. It's dangerous because what they do, they become so in love and so addicted to new knowledge. And I don't mean like intimate knowledge. I mean the English knowledge. They get more information and it's like, wow, wow, wow. Well, yeah, the Torah is full of wows. But they become so engrossed in the details and they are still completely impotent to go out and practice it. You can study all night, but you got to get up in the morning and say the Shema. And if you get up in the morning and say the Shema, there might be a Roman there ready to, skin you alive, so to speak. We cannot leave it at the level of analysis. We can't leave it at a level of correcting other people because they've got the wrong interpretation. If you're going to live at frog level, it means, yes, there is a song and studying Torah, but it also means you've got to get out of the river and sacrifice when you're told to do so. And if you're going to sacrifice, remember that frog basically became a whole burnt offering. He became an olah. He allowed himself to be pulled from his comfort zone, what he felt was his life zone, in order to obey a commandment. All so that Pharaoh and the Egyptians would know the El who favors and the El who helps his people Israel in the fiery furnace of affliction. Had that frog not been willing to offer himself in the oven, how would they have known? And the thing is, the Hebrews were already afraid. The Egyptians needed to be afraid, but the Hebrews were already afraid. Life was hard. Life was bad before the plague started. They were already trembling. And so imagine you're already scared. You already don't know what's going to happen. You've already had the slaughter of the baby boys. You've had the straw. And now on top of this, you're suffering from the blood in the water. You're suffering from the frogs piled on top of that. And it's not until the magicians admit the finger of God has done this with the next plague, it's not until then there's going to be a distinction between you and the Egyptians. And that's what it feels like. This is where we are today. There's so much illness, so much sickness. The diseases of the Egyptians are upon us. And it seems as though there is not one distinction between us and the wicked and those who are living in death. And what are we doing? Tremble, 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 tremble. But we have to tremble for the right one. The one who can give us hope, the one who can give us amazing grace, the one who favors us, the one who helps us. Because people are already afraid. The real plagues have not set in. I mean, we're not talking about a third of the world being wiped out yet. We're on that course, but we already fear everything. People fear government conspiracies, MSG, GMO, terrorism, rising violence, too much immigration, too little immigration, too much grace by the government, not enough grace by the government. We fear everything. So we can even sit here in our study of the Torah and we know the world, what's going on in the world outside of our homes as we study, and it distresses us. We want the world to come to repentance. We want Pharaoh to know who is the El. We want the Egyptians to know. We don't want them to persist in death practices. So we're already trembling, and this is even before someone's going to come and take our life for what we're doing. There are places you could live where we would get in trouble for this. But so far in the United States, and most of the countries where we have students online, nobody's going to knock on your door and then come skin you alive for studying Torah. But we're already in a state of tribulation. And here's what this was in the Talmud. It says, if we are afraid in the element in which we live, how much more in the element in which we would die? So it is with us. If such is our condition when we sit and study the Torah, of which it is written, for that is your life and the length of your days. If we go and neglect it, how much worse off shall we be? In other words, yes, things are bad right now as we study the Torah, but nevertheless, it is our life and it is the length of our days. And remember, the rabbis extended that and said, not just this day, but the day of Messiah, the era of Messiah, the Messianic kingdom. What we are doing right now, in spite of the distress that we're in and the tribulation, it is sustaining. Whether we realize it or not, it is sustaining. And it's not for just right now. It's for when Messiah comes. And Rabbi Kahn wrote, study is great, theory is important, philosophy is necessary, but eventually it has to lead to practice. There's a time to theorize, a time to debate, a time to cast votes, but then there's a time to act, to carry your convictions through to fruition. And it's my comment is it's easy for the frog to sing in the river, but what if he's called to sing through Egypt? Will he get out of the river and do it? Will we get out of the river and go do it? Okay, now here's bad frog. We've talked about good frog. Let's talk about bad frog before we shut it down. It says in Exodus 7:29, and into you and into your people and all your servants, the frogs will ascend. Okay, yeah, I put the Hebrew verse on there so you could see it. Basically, he's saying the frogs are going to go inside of you. Their English translations don't like to put that in there. They like to translate it differently. But it says, into you the frogs will go. It sounds very Yoda-like, right? And Rashi says what they would do is they would go into the Egyptians' intestines and croak. And so I am going to resist the temptation to make all sorts of jokes about that. There's just so many available, but I'm not going to. I'm going to hang tough right here. They went inside. They became basically part of the Egyptians. So Revelation lends us a little more insight into why Rashi might say that. Revelation 16:13 says, I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon and out of the mouth of the beast and out of the mouth of the false prophet 3 unclean spirits, and it says, like frogs. For they are spirits of demons, performing signs which go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them together. Right? See, this time it's not just Pharaoh and his army. It's the kings of the whole world and their armies to gather them together for the war of the great day of God the Almighty. Behold, I am coming like a thief, which is like a little catchword for Rosh Hashanah. Blessed is the one who stays awake and keeps his clothes. That goes back to our garments. We don't want them to be burned up, so that he will not walk about naked and men will not see his shame. You will be ashamed when it's more than just you who realize you have sinned. You realize the entire world can see your sin. And it says, and they gathered them together to the place which in Hebrew is called Harmageddo. I don't know why. Harmageddo. It's not Harmagedon. Harmageddo. The mountain of telling, basically, is how it translates out. So it's a gathering. But first, like the frogs, there was a scattering. These spirits go out. They perform these false signs. And the whole point of the false signs is to gather that army together, basically to lead them in to a situation like the Sea of Reeds, where the waters will kill them. But this time they'll go to the great river, which we know is the Euphrates. That's the river that will dry up. There's actually a midrash that says King David, in one of his campaigns, dried it up temporarily. But at any rate, it's a mirror here of the Reed Sea, where the nations of the rebellious kings are going to be destroyed by the great river. Now, is that literally the Euphrates? Could be. I don't think that's the important thing. If we know that the Parat River, Euphrates, was the river that flowed out from the throne to water the whole garden, then it kind of elevates the explanation to a greater level. In other words, they're going to try to cross back into a place. They're going to see these miraculous signs. Yeshua performed signs, and you don't look for a sign, but he did perform signs that tell us he is able to gather us into the garden again, if we're obedient. Remember the clothes? You have to have the obedience clothes to function in that garden without shame. These kings of the earth are somehow going to believe they can penetrate into that realm. They're going to gather together for war, but what they're going to find out is that's not what's going to happen. They're going to burn up. They can't cross that river. So here's the context. It says, the second angel poured out his bowl into the sea, and it became blood like that of a dead man. And every living thing in the sea died. That's Egypt. Egypt represents death. Then the third angel poured out his bowl into the rivers and the springs of waters, and they became blood. And I heard the angel of the waters saying, righteous are you who are and who were. Remember Mishael, he was the center of the chiasm of the 3 Jews who were thrown into the furnace. The middle one is kind of like the essence. And then the first one was like God favors, and then the third one, Azariah, God helped, favor and help. But in the middle is who he is. And he's like, who is like El? All right. And so he says, righteous are you who are and who were, O Holy One, because you judge these things. For they poured out the blood of the saints and the prophets, and you have given them blood to drink. They deserve it. And I heard the altar saying, yes, O Lord, the Almighty, true and righteous are your judgments. So remember, the altar is the place of the Olah offering, the resurrection offering. When we offer ourselves as a living sacrifice, we're offering ourselves on the altar. And this is where you get this conversation with the saints. And that's the context. The blood of the saints, the blood of the prophets. What did that blood in the Nile represent? The blood of the saints, the blood of the prophets. And all Pharaoh can do is make more blood. He cannot produce life out of that river the way that he lies and says he can. All he can do is make more blood. So John clarifies the context of the plagues. It's going to be vengeance for the suffering of Israel. This suffering and tribulation has an end. And he refers to him as, O Holy One. All right? And that was the problem from the beginning. That's why Moses states what this is all about, that you may know, that you may have an experience with, knowing, Dea, the knowledgeable frog. Pharaoh and those who followed him could not and did not accept one. They still wanted 2,000 plus. But in general, the world has never accepted one, nor can it accept his kingdom. And we know the river Nile is said to represent the Pishon River of Eden, that outermost river that circled the tree of life. And so from the beginning, when Adam and Eve were deceived and sinned and fell out of the garden, we can see that the beast, the serpent, remember the serpent was the most cunning of the beasts, the false prophet, they have poured out the blood of the righteous from the beginning, when Adam and Eve were driven across the Nile, when they were driven across the Pishon River. But the source, the heavenly source of those rivers was the Parat, the Euphrates. It's called the Great River sometimes, or the river. And so to the righteous, we're talking about a journey home when we're reading the book of Revelation. To the wicked, it's a blood trap. It's like the Nile. It's like the Reed Sea. And remember, Yam Suf, which is the Reed Sea, you can translate it out as the final sea or the final day. And that's what it says in Revelation 16:12. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river, the Euphrates, and its water was dried up so that the way would be prepared for the kings from the east, i.e. for their destruction, into the blood trap. So here's a picture of the Shema. I told you knew the song of the frog, and you do. You say that you actually sing the song of the frog twice a day. When you say the Shema, or sing it, hopefully you're singing it. But if you'll notice, it says, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And then there's an insertion before you go on with the rest of the passage. Okay. In between, you insert Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. And you say, well, why do they stick that in there? Because it's doing exactly what Moses told Pharaoh he was going to have to do. He's going to have to know that there is one. There's only one kingdom. There's only one name. There's not 2,000. There's not Pharaoh's kingdom and God's kingdom. There's only one kingdom. And so this acknowledgement of the kingdom and the name, the singular name of Adonai, is inserted in there. And that's why I said, you know the song of the frog, because that's what the frog is saying. According to Perek Shira, which is a work traditionally ascribed to King David, what the frog is singing is that statement from Psalm 72. And so that's why you say, Baruch Shem Kavod, Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. Blessed be the name of his glorious kingdom forever and ever. You are acknowledging what Pharaoh never could, what death never can. Psalm 72:17 says, may his name endure forever. May his name increase as long as the sun shines, and let men bless themselves by him. Let all nations call him blessed. Blessed be the Lord God, the God of Israel, who alone works wonders. That's just like a thumb in the face of Pharaoh. You think your Egyptians are doing things, but they're only death things. You're only making more blood. You're only making more dead frogs. You're only making more serpents. And then it says, blessed be his glorious name forever. That's the verse that's inserted into the Shema. And that's the song of the frog. And it says, may the whole earth be filled with his glory. Amen and amen. The prayers of David, the son of Yishai, are ended. That's the conclusion of the thing. Blessed be his glorious name forever. And tradition tells us that is what the frog is singing. Blessed be his glorious name forever and ever. So when you hear the frog singing in the pond or singing in the river or singing in the lake, what they're singing is Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. And you're going to know that, and nobody else is going to know that. So you're going to have to tell them. Because this is our frog and prince story. The frog was created to begin his song at the evening Shema and to cease his singing at the morning Shema. And that's the phrase that he's singing that's inserted between the first sentence of the Shema, which declares the unity of the name, and then the first paragraph, which has the obligations to love God with all your heart, soul, resources, even unto death. Everything. Meodecha, everything is what it says, is how much you should love him. So what you see is the dragon, the beast, the false prophet, they can only be like a real frog. They're never going to be able to bring themselves to proclaim his name, to love him, or to serve the one Elohim, the creator of the universe. Their signs are false, and their resurrections are never permanent. They're never to very goodness. And that's the secret song the frog bird sings at night. Blessed be his glorious name forever and ever and ever and ever. And you got to admit, that's a cute frog. Even if you don't like frogs, that's a cute frog.